You know, one of the things that's interesting, particularly with the information that's been coming out recently, is the fact that there are historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists that are saying that the interpretations of the ancient world cannot really be defined because there's a lack of continuity as it relates to the peoples and the places, the events, and the things that have taken place. And the reason why that is, and it's quite simply because these different scholars do not want to get into the reality that, as Dr. John Henrik Clarke often taught us, the missing pages of world history is African history. And so it becomes important that if you want a true interpretation of the culture, of the people and the places, there is no way that you can leave Africa out. But because of the sociological conditions of always attempting to make it seem as if African peoples are inferior, primitive, that they have not contributed anything to civilization, because they lack that ability or desire to, we never get the proper cultural interpretations. And so the work that we're doing is meant to look at the world before the European began to write the history books. And to truly understand the Moors, you have to go before the people that we call the Moors. We're dealing with episodic history, and we're dealing with holistic history. The episodic history takes episodes, such as the West African kingdoms that people give credit to: the Ghana Empire, the Malinke Empire, the Songhai Empire. When you look at Egypt, they go from the first dynasty and on. And when you're dealing with the Moors, they tend to look at 710, when it was reconnoitered by Tarif, one of the lieutenants of the African general Tariq, that went in to reconnoiter the southern part of Europe, specifically Spain. And then 711, July of 711 to be exact, Tariq and his African warriors and some Arab translators crossed over into Spain and began their conquest of this area. This was a preemptive strike.
Having assured himself of the necessary command of the sea, Musa sent the Berber Tariq, one of his freedmen, to possess himself of Tangiers and the strong places of the neighbouring districts with a view to crossing over into Spain. Tariq accordingly marched thither and took the strong places and cities of those Berbers. This being done, Tariq wrote to his master, "Musa, I have found here 6 vessels." Musa told him to take them and to sail for Spain. Tariq did so in the year 710 and was joined by Musa himself in the year 711. The conquest took place at the beginning of the 8th century and was for all ordinary purposes complete. It was carried out almost entirely by Berber troops, whom Musa continued to convert, to organise and to draft into Spain. Tangiers, which had always been a Berber stronghold, became for this purpose his military headquarters, and he was enabled perpetually to recruit his conquering armies with fresh troops. Tariq took 12,000 of these converts with him on his first landing. There was a tradition lingering from the Greek occupation of the country that Spain would be conquered only by 2 nations composed of peoples unaccustomed to the luxuries of life, hardened by privation and fatigue. The Arabs and the Andalusians alike translated the prophecy to apply to the Arabs and the Berbers. Shortly after the whole of Spain was reduced, there was a general Arab migration to it, and it was with this Arab migration that the high civilization came. For about 50 years, the Berbers in fitful revolution struggled against the Arabs for the sole possession of a country which they claimed that they and they alone had won. The conflict between the dynasties of the Umayyad and the Abbasid in the east gave opportunities for the disaffected in Spain. But about the middle of the 8th century, when the Abbasids succeeded in overthrowing the dynasty of the Umayyad in the east and possessing themselves of the caliphate, one son of the Umayyad escaped into North Africa and, after many adventures, established himself under the name of Abd al-Rahman, the first upon the throne of his fathers in Spain. He ascended the throne in 757, thus separating the Caliphate of the East from the Caliphate of the West, and brilliantly opened the chapter of cultivated Arab rule in the West. During the first 2 centuries of the rule of the Umayyad, the Arab dominion in Spain reached its highest point. The court of Abd al-Rahman and his successors became the centre of all the art, the learning, the refinement, and the elegance of the known world. Commerce brought to the shores of Spain the best productions of every land. Science was honoured. Arab travellers penetrated to the furthest limits of the Eastern Hemisphere. All that India and China had to teach was known to them. Medieval Arabian achievements in the higher paths of learning are well known. There is no branch of scientific development among the Western nations upon which the Arabs have not set their mark, either by original research or by the service which they rendered in transmitting to their European posterity the learning accumulated by other generations in other lands. They initiated the Renaissance in Europe by preserving and translating at a much earlier period the great works of the Greeks. They gave a vivifying impulse to all the intellectual life of the West by introducing to it the hoarded knowledge of the East. In addition to the geometricians, astronomers, geographers, mechanicians, botanists, chemists, physicians, who appear to have collected all that was known in Asia as well as Europe, and who wrote voluminously the works of many of them amounting to 50 and 60 volumes, every branch of literature was represented. There were histories, essays, poems. There were treatises upon arithmetic, grammar, poetry, rhetoric, canon and civil law, jurisprudence, logic. All the arts to which elaborate architecture and luxurious domestic life gave rise were, of course, highly developed. Painting appears to have been restricted chiefly to decorative work, but we are repeatedly told that the palaces of southern Spain were filled with works of art. It is interesting to note that in the great days of Mohammedan Spain, Arabian women were not confined, as in the East, to harems, but appeared freely in public and took their share in all the intellectual, literary and even scientific movements of the day. Women held schools in some of the principal towns. There were women poets, historians and philosophers, as well as women surgeons and doctors. America alone appears to have been unknown to the Arabs, and when we remember that modern Europe had to wait for the journey of Magellan round the world in the opening years of the 16th century to be quite sure of the shape of the globe, we must admit that in the learning of the Arabs of Spain, Negroland had sources of information far purer than any of which England at that time could boast.
The reason why Africans went in was because of a preemptive strike. And because of this, and because we lack an understanding, we have to go back to the Punic Wars, of which there were 3, that happened before the Common Era. Basically, give or take 300, maybe 200. This is the time of Hannibal Barca, who went to war with the Romans. Hannibal Barca. B-A-R-C-A. This is the Hannibal that we see that's going up into the Alps with elephants and defeating the Romans. There are things that we need to understand about the history of this area. Out of Tunis, this is where Carthage, or what we call Carthage, was.
It seems to result from the most careful investigation that the principal commerce of the interior of Africa has always been carried on in two directions. That which has been described from Ethiopia through the valley of the Nile, and that of the Sudan from the Niger to the Mediterranean coast. The western end of the road, starting from Carthage, ran in a southeasterly direction through the Fezzan to the site of the present Mosul. After making the junction at that point with the Egyptian road, it turned southwards to the Niger and was the road which has been so often mentioned as the Tripoli-Fezzan road of the present day. Along this road, the Carthaginians traded with the Niger for carbuncles, skins, gold, ivory, and other goods. Thus, we get on unquestionable authority evidence of a well-established connection in very early times between Ethiopia and Egypt by the valley of the Nile, between Egypt and Carthage by a road crossing the desert through Siwa and Augala, and between Carthage and the Niger by the present Tripoli-Fezzan route. If we take Mosul and Thebes as lying almost on the same parallels of latitude outside the Tropic of Cancer, and Gao and Meroe as having also almost parallel positions on the edge of the summer rains, some 8 degrees farther south, we get the 4 corners of an irregular parallelogram, of which 3 sides were in permanent communication with each other.
These were the cousins to the Phoenicians who were in present-day Lebanon, and these were the traders, and these were the merchants. Phoenicia basically comes from the word purple. And as Dr. Ivan van Sertima tells us, purple was the color of royalty. Purple was a color that was looked upon as a very important color. Purple was with the Greek Empire. Purple was with the Senate in the Roman Empire. Purple was a color that was traded for generations and generations because it had an important esoteric value. Purple is the last color as it relates to the rainbow. You go from infrared to ultraviolet. So these Phoenicians, these traders in the color purple, dealt with their cousins who also were traders from Carthage, and this is why they were wealthy Africans in Tunis.
The civilization of the Phoenicians, contemporary at least in part with the history of Egypt, dates also from the earliest periods of which civil history has any record. The Phoenicians are believed to have migrated from Eritrea on the coast of the Red Sea about the year 2000 BC to the Mediterranean, where they were first established on a strip of Syria between the chain of Lebanon and the sea, and afterwards took possession of a portion of Greece, of some of the islands of the Mediterranean, and of the principal promontories along the coast of Africa to the Straits of Gibraltar, and as far down the western coast as the mouths of the Senegal. They also colonized Spain and spread up the coast of Western Europe, navigating as far as the Baltic and the English Channel. Carthage, of later growth, is believed to have been founded about 853 BC. Other Phoenician cities on the coast of Africa were of far greater antiquity than Carthage, and Phoenician trade in the Gulf of Salé on the west coast of Morocco was famous for many centuries before the Romans gave to that part of the coast the name of Sinus Emporicus, or Merchants' Bay. Phoenicia, like Syria, was never one state, but from the earliest period down to the Persian monarchy was always divided into a number of separate cities, each with its little territory around it. Allied cities in Phoenicia were very numerous, and it is thought probable that there may have been periods when all the cities of Phoenicia formed one confederation, at the head of which at one time stood Sidon, and at a later period, Tyre. Throughout the colonies of Phoenicia, as well as in the mother country, a common religion formed likewise a bond of union for the cities and strengthened and preserved the connection between them. The chief authority was placed in the hands of kings, who in turn were to some extent controlled by high priests. The revenues of the cities depended in large measure on their trade, and the Phoenicians have lived in history as a commercial people. Through a considerable portion of their history, the Phoenicians appear to have acted as commercial agents for Egypt. As they sailed, it is related that they landed on the coasts, sowing the land and waiting for harvests. Thus, a tradition of them lingers on the west coast as well as on the east, and to them it is in some quarters believed that the legend of the first white men in western Negro land may be traced. Carthage had intercourse across the desert with Negro land, and drew thence its supply of elephants, as well as gold and carbuncles. We may perhaps therefore carry back the date to a period when the Phoenicians dominated Egyptian politics, and the worship of Astarte or Venus Erycina was common in the valley of the Nile. It is interesting also to observe in Egyptian records the constant reference to magicians of the south. The part which magic played in the chronicles of Egypt is of course a matter of common knowledge. The whole north coast of Africa was, we are told, protected by talismans, burning glasses, and other marvels raised on pedestals which were placed at intervals along the shore. Alexandria could not be built till talismans had been erected which had power to protect it from the monsters of the deep.
So that to understand who the Moors were, you have to step back. You have to go beyond 710, 711 AD. Who were these people that went into Spain? And you would have to understand that the Moors, they were the Etruscans. The Etruscans were Africans that had built the city known as Etruria. Etruria is the country we today call Italy. The Etruscans were on the islands of Sardinia, on the island of Corsica. They were developing civilizations in the Mediterranean basin. There were Africans that were in Spain 1,000 years before the Common Era. We have to see that the language of the Etruscans comes directly out of the Niger-Congo language, which goes from West Africa through Central Africa to Southern Africa. It is the base upon which Kiswahili is based. It is the language upon which most Africans are now in dialogue to. The largest group of Niger-Congo speakers are the Bantu people. I don't care for the word Bantu, but the basic thing is that these are the well-melanated Africans that show evidence of the civilization of linguistical culture comes out of the Niger-Congo language, and this was the language spoken in the Mediterranean basin. When you go over to Turkey, this was an African place. When you go to Greece, it was African. When you go over into Italy, it was African. And guess what? The capital of the country, Etruria, was called Rume, R-U-M-A. We're talking linguistics now. That is why the capital of Italy today is called what? Rome. It came directly out of this. All of the Roman baths, all of the Roman civilizations, the architecture of Rome came from the Etruscans. These were the individuals that had settled in this area thousands of years ago when there were no other cultural groups in this area. There were no Greeks, there were no Romans. This is what most modern day cultural anthropologists don't want to talk about, because you'd have to give credit to the people who developed these civilizations. So that to understand who the Moors were, you then would have to understand the three distinct dynasties of the Moorish Empire from 711 to 1492. The first being the Umayyad Abbasid, the second being the Almoravid, and the third being Almohade. And what's important in terms of understanding these three dynasties and how long they reigned and what they brought to the civilization, you would have to understand not just North Africa, you have to understand West Africa. But to understand what would populate West Africa with civilizations that could bring forward great things, you'd also have to understand what happened in North Africa as it relates to a particular river and what exactly was going on in Africa at a certain time in history. Climatological experiences. Go back 5,000 years before the Common Era. You're dealing with what is called the AHP, the African humid phase. It is at this time that North Africa is lush. It has trees, it has forests, it has savanna grasslands that's growing fruits and vegetables. It has lively rivers, and it's also important to understand that although we see these rivers today in Africa as being unconnected, the West Africa, the Senegal River, the Niger River, okay? In Central Africa, you have the Congo River. In East Africa, you have the Hapi or the Nile River. When you go down south, you have the Limpopo and the Orange River. What's important to understand is that during this humid phase, this wet phase, all of these rivers were connected. And there was lively trade going on. There is evidence of trading merchant materials that came from West Africa. You got it in South Africa. There are things that are grown in South Africa that you see in East Africa. There are things in Central Africa that you see in North Africa. And so we also have to know that the beginnings of the human family, the Twa and Mbuti people from Central and Southern Africa, began as hunters and gatherers. But then they got on the rivers and they began to fish. This is where they got a lot of their vitamin D. This is where they got a lot of their supplement food. They became fisher people and they became water people, and they traveled across the entire African continent. I know this may be difficult to understand, but when someone tells a perfect lie, the truth is unbelievable. And so that as an African people, Africa was a lively trading group of people. You have ivory, elephant ivory, in Italy. How did it get there? You have ivory in America. How did it get there? Ain't no elephants in America, at least not indigenous to America. And so what you have to ask yourself, that these cultural anthropologists don't want to get into, because they know that they're going to have to go black. They're going to have to understand that this is what Africa contributed to the world. We're not talking superiority or inferiority. That's not the point. The point is, what is the truth that brought civilizations into where they are today, that the Western world is now the recipient of? How did it happen? Starting in the Atlas Mountains in Algeria, coming down and swerving through North Africa and bending over into West Africa to the country that we today call Southern Mauritania, there is evidence of a river. And this river is called the Taman Rasset River. Tamanrasett. I'm a teacher. I got the spell. Taman Rasset River. And this river was a lively trading place between all of these African peoples from West Africa to East Africa to Central Africa to Southern Africa, and all the tributaries and the lakes that branch off from that allowed these traders to go all over the place and travel. And it was during this time, the African humid phase, that the Taman Rasset River acted and brought up a civilization of people that were traders throughout the African continent. However, there was a phenomenon in the northern part of the earth known as the Worm Ice Age. This Worm Ice Age, while bringing frozen times to the northern climate that caught Africans up there, at the same time, it brought heavy rains into North Africa. These heavy rains, as time went on through the African humid phase, began to change into what's called the AAP, which is the African arid phase. And in this dryness, with the heavy rains that had fallen, it ate up all of the richness of the soil. And what was once lush green started the Sahara Desert. The evidence of it is that you can literally see the sands of East Africa off the coast of West Africa in a place called Cap Captimiris, Captimiris. You can see these same sands that's in the Sahara in Kemet. You can also see them on the West African, just outside of the coast of what we call southern Mauritania. Now, when this dryness occurred, the trade that the Africans had been going through was so rich they didn't want to give it up. So what they did is they started to dig underground tunnels where they could continue their travels and their trades from one place to another. But what was interesting is that there came a time after being underground for a long period of time, sometimes without fresh water and fresh food, what they started to do was to dig a tunnel that would come back up on the ground. And what would they create? They would create what we call oases. And these oases is where they would freshen up their animals, freshen up themselves for food, get fresh water, and then they'd go back underground to continue their trade wherever they were going, east, west, south, or however.
Gao was celebrated in ancient times as a town of magicians, whence the pharaohs on occasion summoned help. Borg and its neighbourhood to the south of Gao is to this day celebrated for the pursuit of magic, and the whole coast of West Africa is permeated with a belief in witchcraft and charms. Doubtless, when Egyptian records speak of the south, they frequently mean Ethiopia and Meroe. But that the name of Ethiopia was extended in some instances to cover the country as far west as the Atlantic is made quite clear by ancient writers. I may mention a fact told me by Ziber Pasha when, during his confinement at Gibraltar in 1886, he related to me the history of the foundation of his ephemeral empire. He was informed that he had to fight against magicians who habitually came out of the earth, fought, and then disappeared. A careful system of scouting disclosed to him the fact that they came from underground, and when, after cutting off their retreat and conquering them, he insisted upon being shown their place of habitation, he found it to be deeply buried in the sand, a wonderful system of temples, far finer, to use the words in which he described it, than modern eyes have seen in the mosques of Cairo and Constantinople. It was, he said, such work of massive stone as was done only by the great races of old. Through this underground city of stone there ran a stream, and by the stream his native antagonists lived in common straw native huts. "Were your people then," he asked them, "a nation of stonecutters?" And they said, "Oh no, this is not the work of our forefathers, but our forefathers found it here, and we have lived for many generations in these huts."
The creation of the Sahara Desert was so profound that the Africans realized, I guess it's time for us to get up and find a new place to live. And so those Africans that were on one side of the Tamanrasset River, from the Atlas Mountains, they traveled north. The other Africans who were on the other side of the river, they traveled southwest, following the same sands where Cape Temiris is. And so what they did, these Africans, they started, give or take 3,000 years before the Common Era, maybe 2,500 years before the Common Era. They had established what was called settlements. Dartichet was one, Darwalata was one, Dartangent was one. Settlements of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And what they did is that they consolidated their settlements into one because they were so expansive, and they started a city, a kingdom that's known as Wagadu.
The Berber tribes, dispossessed and driven southwards by the Arabs, made room for themselves at different periods in the Fertile Belt, and in doing so necessarily fought with and overthrew or were overthrown by the blacks. This resulted in a very great admixture of blood, and though the black strain would seem generally to have prevailed in point of colour, the characteristics of the races occupying the Fertile Belt were in the course of centuries so modified that in speaking of them, it will perhaps be more accurate to employ the word black than the in many ways misleading term of Negro. The true Negro is hardly to be found amongst these races of the northern inland belt, the cast of face, even when jet black in colour, being frequently European in form, with the high nose, thin lips, and deep-set eyes, characteristic still of the Arab of the Mediterranean coast. In the year 1067, Ghana was still the principal black kingdom of the Western Sudan. The name of its reigning sovereign was Tenkamenin, who ascended the throne in the year 1062 in succession to his maternal uncle, Bechi. It was the custom amongst these blacks for the succession to go always to the son of the king's sister. The Black Kingdom of Ghana, already famous in the 8th century, had risen in prosperity and importance and had spread northwards, conquering amongst other territories the kingdom of Audagast. In the year 1054, the town of Audagast, still rich and flourishing, not only acknowledged the rule of Ghana and paid tribute, but was also a place of residence of the Black Monarch. But in the following year, 1055, the Almoravides, already setting out upon their northward march, made a first example of this town. They took it by assault and sacked and pillaged it, exposing it to every horror of barbaric warfare. And it is especially stated that they treated the population of Audagast with this extreme rigour because the town had acknowledged the sovereignty of the Black King of Ghana. The town of Ghana, which, after the sack of Audagast kings, was composed, according to El-Bekri, of two towns situated in a plain. One town was Mussulman and the other pagan. The king himself was a pagan and lived in the pagan town. The Mussulman town was very large and contained no less than 12 mosques. All these mosques had their imams, their mueddins, and their salaried readers. There were also schools and centres of learning, and according to the author of the Tariq-es-Sudan, the town, besides being the meeting place of commercial caravans from all parts of the world, was the resort of the learned, the rich, and the pious of all nations. This account is fully borne out by later writers. El-Idrisi, writing in 1153, describes the king's residence as being a well-built castle, thoroughly fortified, decorated inside with sculptures and pictures, and having glass windows. El-Bekri makes no mention of glass, but says that the king's residence in the pagan town consisted of a castle surrounded by native huts. He mentions that the buildings generally were composed of stone and acacia wood. The native town was 6 miles distant from her Mussulman town, but the whole space was covered by suburbs, consisting of stone houses standing in gardens. In the native town, there was one mosque for the use of Mohammedans occupied on duty round the king. The king's principal ministers and advisors were at this time Mohammedans, and he and his heir presumptive wore Mohammedan dress, but the religion of the country was still devoutly pagan, and all other persons of native religion, except the king and his heir, wore robes of cotton, silk, brocade, according to their means. The local religion, evidently different from the paganism now practiced among the lower-class tribes upon the coast, had yet certain points of resemblance. The wealth of the country was very great. The soil was fertile and gave generally 2 crops a year. Gold was abundant. The custom, according to El-Bekri, was that all nuggets found in the mines of the empire belonged to the sovereign, while the public was allowed to keep the gold dust. Without this precaution, El-Bekri gravely states, gold would become so abundant that it would have hardly any value. The nuggets found in the mines of Ghana varied usually in weight from an ounce to a pound. Some were much larger. The king had one which weighed 30 pounds. there was a part of the country called El Ferroin, in which gold was so plentiful and salt so scarce that salt was sold for its weight in gold. It was indeed a fine movement of historic fate which caused the conqueror of Ghana to become the instrument of the foundation of Timbuktu. The prosperity of Timbuktu, says the author of the Tariq-es-Sudan, who was himself born in that town in the year 1596, was the ruin of Ghana. Before the great days of Timbuktu, Ghana, he tells us, was the centre of the Sudan. After the rise of Timbuktu, all was gradually transferred. Timbuktu drew to itself not only the wealth, but the learning and enlightenment of the civilized world, and became the home of all that was pure, delightful, and illustrious in the Sudan.
Ouagadougou. Ghana is Ouagadougou. Ghana was the name of the king. It wasn't the name of the country. And so you have what we today call Ghana, but Ghana becomes Mali, and Mali becomes Songhai. But the reality is that Ouagadougou and what we call Ghana existed thousands of years ago. Because they want to go to the medieval period and say that's when ancient Ghana started. That's not when ancient Ghana started. Ancient Ghana was in existence thousands of years before that. And so that when you have this West African impact, West African civilizations, you then have people coming from other parts of the world coming in, invading, and then claiming that they wrote the scrolls of Timbuktu. But the scrolls of Timbuktu had been written for thousands of years. They just took claim to the fact that they did it. So we don't, and then cultural interpretations, they don't know what they're reading, so they start talking this nonsense about what they think they're reading, but you need the African people with an African mindset, with an African cultural common sense, that can then interpret these scrolls for what they really mean in terms of their interpretations. And so when we're looking at West Africa, and we're looking at these three kingdoms, the Umayyad, the Abbasid, the Almoravids, and the Almohade, that's why it's important to understand by the time you get to the Almohade, these are the people that are going to do battle with some of the Almoravids, and that is what's going to eventually destroy the Moors. And by January 2nd, 1492, Boabdil is going to be expelled from Granada. And that is when the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon are going to take over. They're going to take over all the castles that the Africans had built. And then they're going to build a process of the development, of the destruction, of the credit to give to African people, which sprinklings of Arabs who had adapted to the African traditions. It's important to understand that Islam was born in the mountains of Ethiopia. And it was brought into Saudi Arabia somewhere in the 600 after the Common Era, AD. And it was Bilal who brought it in and started this structure. It was another Ethiopian by the name of Antara, who was a poet, who gave what we call I call it the Afrabic language. And I call people Afrabs. Because to be an Arab means you are mixed with African. And so the Afrabic language, based in sprinklings of the Amharic language of Ethiopia, other regional languages of Africa and Ethiopia, languages of African descent that already existed in Yemen and existed in Saudi Arabia, which is an African peninsula. Dr. Clark used to always say, to draw a map of Africa and not include Saudi Arabia is like leaving your arm out of a picture of your body. You must include Saudi Arabia. You must include Madagascar as part of the African experience. Because that's the language. The languages spoken in these areas are African. And so when you have Indo-Europeans coming down, these early people of Indo-European background, they mixed with Africans. And then they created mixtures of people that were African and Indo-European. So to look at and to think that the Arab people were very separate from the African people is a misnomer. And it creates a problem in our ability to understand the cultural interpretations. Of course now, the base of the foundations of the educational system, the math, the science, the language, okay, the history of this area is by no doubt African. But there are other people coming in and growing in that culture, growing in that language, bringing their own cultural understandings to what they're grounded in. And so you have this mixture of people. So by the time you have what we call the people going into Spain, and we talk about Arabs, you also have to understand that it is like Nigerians and maybe African Americans coming together to do something, because that's what they look like. They look like a mixture of Africans and Indo-Europeans, just like many African and African diasporian people are a mixture of Europeans and Africans. But they are still African-based because the knowledge base is African. And so the Moors become important to us to understand who the Moors were, because the Moors were the creators of what we call Western civilization. It was the brilliance of a Spanish king named Alfonso, who interpreted the words of Arabic and had the Arabic language translated into Latin. That is based Spanish, French, Italian, the languages that we call Portuguese, all of those are based on Vulgar Latin. Vulgar then was translated and it became Spanish, it became French. And with that came the knowledge that Alfonso had interpreted from the Arabic language, and then that's what's going to permeate the world. Then they're going to create these Treaty of Tordesillas, late 1400s, 1495, 1522. You're going to have this Pope that is going to give half the world to Portugal and half the world to Spain. And the western part of the world is going to be given to Spain, and the eastern part of the world is going to be given to Portugal. And then the Pope is going to say, I now give, with the dum diversas, I now give you permission to enslave the non-believers. I now give you permission to go into Africa and to enslave the non-believers. But really what he was doing, he was saying, I give you permission to steal the land of the Moors, where the Moors had in Spain, and now I want you to take them out of Spain and bring them to the Caribbean, so that you can take their land by their version of eminent domain. And that's really what's going on here. What happens is that they have two different Treaty Tordesillas. That's why I gave you two dates. The second one pushed the line, what's called the line of demarcation, the line that cuts the world in half. They move it more over to the west, which is going to give Portugal, since they got the east, they push it more to the west, which is going to give Portugal. Because remember, Cristobal Colon is married to Portuguese royalty. He is a double agent for the Portuguese. The reason why he's working with the Spaniards is because they got the money, because the great majority of wealth of the Moors was in Spain and not Portugal. So he gets Spain to bankroll, but at the same time, he's giving Portugal information about this new so-called world. Now, we already know that Cristobal Colon knew about the American continent, because we find Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus, on the west coast of Africa, 1482, 10 years before 1492, he working with the Portuguese in Cape Verde and West Africa, because that's why so many Cape Verdeans speak Portuguese. And so Cristobal Colon is aware of America, but he wants to get some money so he can come here because he wants to become king of America. But he's double agent for the Portuguese. The Diary of Cristobal Colon. You should really read that, by John Boyd Thatcher. See, because I give you names, I give you books, because I want you to understand. I don't want you to believe me. I just want to make you think. And I want you to understand why people are telling you that they cannot come to the conclusions they need to because the interpretations cannot be made. Yes, the interpretations can be made, but they're afraid of what the interpretations will reveal if they have to go back to Africa as the origin of all things and all places. John Boyd Thatcher was talking about Cristobal Colon was writing. When he was coming to America, he was passing Africans going back to Africa from America. And when he got here to America, the native indigenous people had a very special spearhead that was made from a very unique combination of silver, gold, and electrum. It was called guanin. And they called it guanin because of the kings of Ghana. They called it guanin because it was unique and it came from Africa. And the Native Americans told them that. And not only that, but when Cristobal Colon came here, he said that he saw people that were as well melanated, if they were more black in America than the Africans they passed going back to Africa. This is all recorded in history, but you got to look for it. But nobody want to look for it because everybody's afraid of what they're going to find if you have to tell the truth of exactly what happened. These were the Moors. There were many Africans on the boats that came to America. They don't tell you that. They leave this out of the history books to help us understand exactly who the Moors were and what the Moors did and how they came to this part of the world. And it was the Spaniards who were the first ones to come to this part of the world. And it was here that was embedded the legacy of the African tradition from the Moors. As the other countries of Europe, because England got it very upset. England said, well, who is the Pope to give half the world to Portugal and half the world to Spain? Who were they? Who had the authority to do that? And they said, well, the Pope. The Pope is the most important person in the world. Well, England said, well, I think we're going to change that. And so what did they do? Martin Luther created the Protestant movement. They were protesting the Pope giving land to the Spanish and the Portuguese. It had nothing to do with all that other stuff about getting married or divorced or whatever that stuff was. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the fact that now the other European countries wanted to get in on Africa, wanted to get in on America. And so they started a Protestant movement that became the Protestant religion. And what England did is they said, the Pope don't have no sway over us no more. We got the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's going to tell us. And that's when the Archbishop of Canterbury said, well, you have every right to go to America. You have every right to enslave Africans. Who is the Pope? I am in charge of this Anglican church. And I'm giving you permission to do what you have to do. So now here's where you start seeing the Spanish and the British and the French and everybody fighting each other over the prosperous of Africa, over the prosperous of coming to America. You have the French coming in, the Huguenots. You got the British coming in. You've got the Dutch coming in. You got the Dutch East India Company going to South Africa while the Dutch West Indian Company is coming to America, settling in a place where I come from, but then it was called New Amsterdam. The Dutch created New Amsterdam. Why? Because it was a new Amsterdam, Holland. And then British came in and said, well, I think I want some of this. And they had a war. They fought each other for a while, and then they made a deal. And the British owned Suriname, and the Dutch owned New York. And so they said, well, let's stop fighting each other. So what we're going to do is I'll give you the Dutch Suriname, and you give us New Amsterdam. So they made a trade. Then the British came to New Amsterdam, and they said, but we don't want that name Amsterdam, so we're going to change it. And we're going to name it after the Duke of York. And so they called it New York. And they took over Wall Street, all the trading down there, and all the other things going on. See, this is the history that's being left out. Some of the important dates to understand in terms of the three dynasties is the Umayyad and Abbasid coming in at 711. This dynasty existed until 1086 AD, or after the Common Era, which basically is 375 years. This first dynasty existed. The next dynasty was the Almoravid. And then the third dynasty, the Almohade. In 719, the Moors invade France, being repelled by Charles Martel, who is the grandfather of Charlemagne. And they retreat back to what we call Al-Andalusia. In 837 AD, the Moors capture Sicily. In 846, the Moors invade Italy. And what they did is they decided that they were going to retreat and move back and create their civilization in Al-Andalus. And what you're basically looking at is the fact that Al-Andalus is going to be, their northern boundary is going to be a diagonal mountain range known as Sierra de Guadarrama, which runs in a northeasterly direction. From Coimbra in Portugal to Zaragoza, from whence the Ebro River may be taken as another approximate boundary. So you have the Ebro River that is going to be basically the eastern boundary of Al-Andalus. And then you're going to have Coimbra in Portugal is going to be the western boundary. And then the coastline is going to be the southern boundary of Al-Andalus. And so the Moors at this time enjoyed the fertile valley of the Tagus, Guadagna, and Guadalquivir. So that north of the Sierra de Guadarrama is cold and wet, non-productive. But on the southern part of the mountains is where everything can grow. And so when you're looking at these different areas, you begin to realize the things that the Moors actually brought into Spain. For instance, the city of Cordoba. The Moorish city of Cordoba, which is often regarded as the medieval world's most cosmopolitan and sophisticated city, possessed in the 10th century, the 900s, 1,600 mosques, 900 public baths, 213,077 middle-class homes, 60,300 mansions, and 80,455 shops and businesses. Wealthier homes consisted of 2 floors, a library, a garden, which we're talking about the Carmens, the gardens that they had. It was just part of the life of the people. Everybody had this. It wasn't about the rich and the poor. Everybody had the ability to grow gardens, and they had running water. Cordoba's population was estimated between 500,000 to 1 million people. Now, these figures that I'm giving you was compiled by a 17th century scholar, Maghrib el-Makari. And you can go to the Golden Age of the Moor, page 213, to do that research on what this gentleman, what this scholar put together. The Spanish city of Cordoba in the 10th century was very much like a modern day city. Its streets were well paved, and there were raised sidewalks for pedestrians to walk. At night, you could walk for 10 miles by the light of lamps that flanked an uninterrupted extent of buildings. This is what we're looking at as it relates to what Africans brought into Spain. When you look at Moorish agriculture, Europe came to be advanced because of this empire. This science that was brought in to Spain was more immense than those of either Alexander the Great of Greece or Rome at its height. Rice was introduced into Europe by the Moors in the 10th century, cotton by the 9th. A Moorish botanist by the name of Ibn Basal parceled out the land, partitioned the land into 10 different classes according to particular characteristics, and taught the farmers ways of increasing their fertility by their plots. Surveys were done to locate sweet water below the earth. Widespread use was made of the waterways, which the Moors had introduced into Spain. The water wheel, introduced into Spain by Africans. The Romans also did this, but they did it very little. The Moors dug channels to irrigate the farmlands and provide water for thousands of houses and mosques and palaces and public baths. They not only increased the fertility of the soil with their new methods and tools and plants and manures, but they also ushered in the sciences of food preservation and storage. They could store wheat for as long as 100 years. Their methods of drying enabled such food as figs, plums, cherries, and apples to remain edible for several years. This is what Africans brought into Europe. In Moorish education, the Moors gradually erected on the Greek foundations an intellectual edifice of their own. No field of Greek or African learning, from philosophy to math, medicine, and botany, was neglected. There were Moorish brotherhoods and sisterhoods. Now you know where all of the different fraternities and sororities and Knights of Columbus and all of the different houses came from. They brought it in. It didn't exist before that. Ibn Hayim, a Cordovan-born Muslim, described the educational system. The curriculum included the study of the Holy Quran, evaluating and interpreting the word, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, fractions, plane geometry, in that order. And by the way, I've taught early childhood. That's how we teach math to children from kindergarten to the 2nd grade. They brought in Euclid's celestial bodies, which is astromath, Ptolemy's Almagest, which is the study of finity and infinity. They brought in logic and the laws of polarity. They taught botany, zoology, geology, and medicine in that order. And when you study, and again, my teaching in middle school, you know that we study earth science, life science, in that order. The way in which they taught then is the way we teach now. History, emphasizing causes for ascension and decline in ancient society with the intention of avoiding repeated errors. So you're always ascending as it relates to the historiography. And then, of course, they studied religious law, which is called Sharia. Here is where the translations occurred, and here is where the European began to interpret and be able to overcome what was happening and shake the African influence off of European civilization. Translations from the Arabic, the medieval language of science. The translations from the Arabic provided links between Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, and England. Alfonso X promoted Moorish wisdom at every opportunity, and the first university of Christian Spain was founded by Alfonso VIII in the 13th century, and the teachers employed there were Africans, Muslims, and Jews. The flowering of the educational systems in Europe, the development of universities in Moorish Andalus include the University of Bologna, 1180, the University of Montpellier in France, 1200, check it out, Africans created Oxford in England. We're so proud. We're the first to graduate from Oxford. We don't even know. We created Oxford. 1209, Valencia in Spain. 1223, the University of Toulouse in France. In 1224, the University of Naples in Italy. In 1250, the University of Salamanca in Spain. 1257, hold tight now, we created Cambridge in England. The destruction of the ancient wisdom, Cardinal Ximenes de Cisneros started a massive burning of African and Arab books post-1492. According to Pascual Gazangos, Cardinal Ximenes de Cisneros ordered the burning of nearly 800,000 books in the public square of Granada. The cardinal is said to have asserted that since the books were all in Arabic, they were Qurans and therefore dangerous. These were all the books that Alfonso X had not translated into Latin. It also inspired a similar bonfire of Native American books, known as codices, by Bishop de Landa in the Yucatan, in America. Catholic Spain compelled Spaniards to destroy many Moorish manuscripts that the conquistadores acquired after the fall of Granada in 1492. Western civilization was initiated by the defeat of the Moorish kingdom in Europe and world exploration using Moorish technology by way of the Crusades is what brought Western civilization into the world. The destruction of the indigenous people, or the near destruction of the indigenous people of the Americas, the enslavement of African people, and it is the same people that taught them how to get on the water and come to America are the very same people that they enslaved, so that those that were enslaved were forbidden to read and to ever learn that they were the ones that allowed them to create the civilization that they are flourishing from. This American hemisphere was built by Africans on the back of the Moorish information that was given to them in Europe, that was brought by enslaved to America, and we built this country. And so as we move through this process, we come to understand exactly what happened. So in other words, to help us understand who the Moors were and exactly what happened during history at this time for this to be able to be made possible. And so with this understanding of who the Moors were before the Moors, to understand that the Moors were already in the Mediterranean basin long before 711, long before 711 to 1492. The Western civilization had already been created. The cities that would become in Europe, they were already existing in Cordoba, in Malaga, in Seville. They already existed. And as you go through and you see these cities and understand the Alhambra and all that they created, you get to understand. See, this is the history that's being left out.